Captain America was created in the early 40s. He was one of the first Marvel Comics characters. And it was kind of the war was on the horizon, and an economic decision. People will buy comics with a patriotic superhero. And they created him, and he came out in Captain America Comics #1, which was very famous because it came out before we entered the war. And on the cover, he's punching Hitler right in the mouth. And it sold 1 million copies. So they knew they had something right from the bat, that people would respond to a patriotic character who wasn't like Superman flying around in the underwear, or even Batman who was dressed like a giant mouse. This was something that was a little more real. Superman's the first one in 1938. Batman comes a year later in 39. But then the war starts to happen, and things like superheroes with aliens and people dressed like bats, some don't become as realistic anymore. So they created characters like Cap. They knew with all this stuff going on in the world that this was a big concern of people, and especially of young people, because kids are the ones buying comics at this point. And they're worried that their parents are talking about what they're reading in the newspapers. They're worried about what they're seeing on the newsreels. So a lot of it's economic, that they knew kids would respond to a patriotic superhero. But comics and superheroes are all about this American mythology. They speak to these things about ourselves that we're not always ready to talk about. And one of them is patriotism. One of them is, what is this country we live in? And Cap's about all those things, standing for patriotism and the flag, but also questioning it a lot of times. And readers have always responded to that. The story is Steve Rogers, this skinny little guy from Brooklyn, wants to join the army, but he's a 4-H, and they say, you're out of here, you can't join for World War II. But he takes the super soldier serum, and without working out at all, he gets to be physically strong and fast. And that was kind of a fantasy for kids, that they felt like they wanted to go fight in a war they didn't really understand, but they felt the call and wanted to. And here's a comic of a guy who just gets stuck once in the arm, and all of a sudden he's fighting. I think that spoke to a lot of fantasies. But it's also, like you said, he doesn't fly, he doesn't have heat vision, or he doesn't have all these other powers. He's just a guy with a shield. And more importantly, he's a soldier. In the late 30s, Krypton and fake places like Gotham City, that was really cool. But with the war approaching, things just became much more focused. Things became more real when you started worrying about your big brother being drafted to go fight in a war in Europe. All of a sudden that big brother becomes Captain America. Superman never goes over there. They show him, with soldiers and stuff on the covers, but he stays in America, says he's going to fight the war on the home front, because they know if he goes over there, that kids will realize it's completely fake. So Captain America is the only one who can go over. There's all these great adventures of Captain America over there in Europe, and he can get shot. He can get killed. He's a little stronger than the rest of us, but he is very much a soldier, and that he is in constant danger. And that was very different from the superheroes people had seen before. And the fact that he doesn't have the big powers and he doesn't have a gun either. He has a shield, he has the costume, and he's fighting for his life every single issue, and he could die, which makes him all the more heroic. And makes him one of us. So people were reading his adventures, kind of at the same time they were reading the newspaper accounts of battles and seeing the newsreels. So the fiction is right next to those real life accounts, which makes it really interesting. Comics in the 40s were just kind of churned out of all these, really cramped, tight offices because they were making a lot of money. And there were a few other patriotic superheroes, and there was a guy named Joe Simon who wanted to make the next one. He started sketching out this figure in a flag-like costume with a shield, and he said, this is going to be Captain America eventually. And that's how it started. And he got an artist for it, and it was approved right away. And all the other patriotic superheroes are kind of lost to time, but Captain America was the one that stuck. He wrote in his autobiography that when he was a kid in Rochester, New York, he remembered this really old and kind of bent down Civil War veteran coming to his class and saying, "Come here, I'm going to shake all of your hands." And the whole class shook his hand, and then he stopped and said, "You just shook the hand of the man who shook Lincoln's hand." And he said, I never knew this man's name, but for some reason, this image of someone that was really old but extremely patriotic stuck with him. He said it was iconic to him. And at the end, he unfurled this really old Civil War flag that has the 13 stars, and the stars were shaped in a star symbol, which is very much like Captain America's shield. But Simon says, I never knew this man's name. So I did some digging, and I found out that there was a Civil War veteran named James Hard, who was the second longest living Civil War veteran in history. And he lived in Rochester, New York, and he would go around to schools and shake people's hands and say, I shook Lincoln's hand. And it made me see that there was this real parallel between his life and Captain America, which is just a story. That, I mean, he served in the Civil War, he did shake Lincoln's hand, he didn't get any awards or any commendations for battle, but yet this man, he lived till he was 111, saw a century of America, and remained patriotic, adapted to all these different changes, much like Captain America does. So Captain America's been around a long time. In the comics, he's frozen and then he's thawed back to life, and he comes out of it and says, what's going on? That's kind of like this veteran must have been living for 111 years. And he would be in parades, the newspapers would follow him, and he was very happy that for his whole life he had always voted a straight Republican ticket ever since Lincoln. Lincoln was the first person he voted for. I mean, can you imagine that? So I always find that interesting, that these characters that we think are so unreal and kind of kiddie characters, they walk around in the colorful costumes and have names like Captain America, they have a kernel of truth to them. And here, somewhere inside this big mythological character, is this little old Civil War veteran who lived till 1953. And to me, that's why we still keep coming back to this stuff, because part of it's true.